Well, on behalf of the School of Foreign Service and on behalf of the McCourt School of Public Policy and our very newest dean here on campus, Maria Kanchan, let me all welcome you to Georgetown and welcome you to the Lloyd George Lecture Series on the Future of the World Order. I want to recognize first our co-sponsor of this event, the Institute of Politics and Public Service, led by Mo Aleti. And I also want to thank the GU Politics team for all the hard work they did in organizing this very important conversation. I also want to thank Barbara Bodine and the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and Milan Verveer at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security for their strong support and engagement in this event. Now, we live in a most extraordinary age. These were the words that Father Edmund A. Walsh used from this very lectern 100 years ago to inaugurate the new School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown, the very first School of International Affairs in the United States. The extraordinary age then was marked by war and violence. Alliances were unraveling, trade was collapsing, a massive effort to rebuild communities and nations was required. The leaders of the world gathered together in Paris 100 years ago to rebuild a world order. They restructured empires, they sought to create new international organizations, they sought to build new trade links and build a new framework for international cooperation to replace the traditional balance of power rivalries with new principles and values rooted in international law and a pursuit of collective security. They made many errors, some catastrophic. They were not able to sustain the peace, but they did establish a set of core principles of multilateral engagement, trade, collective security, and the framework for a liberal world order that would ultimately shape the post-war era. Today, we find ourselves again in a most extraordinary age, but rooted in a very different set of challenges. Yes, there are indeed still wars, there's violence, but rather than rebuilding after devastation, we face the foreboding of new risks. Values and principles that were the foundation of the post-war order are for the first time in a generation being challenged across the globe. Multilateralism, openness and migration, trade, and the commitment to democracy and human rights are all being questioned and debated. New rivalries are taking shape. New technologies are already remaking the security landscape. One can't help but feel a sense of foreboding, a sense of risk. The critical foundations of the existing order are being chipped away with potentially dire consequences. At the same time, it must be recognized that some of those very foundations of the post-war order had not been meeting the needs and concerns of critical constituencies around the globe. In this most extraordinary age, we believe that Georgetown University is called to create a forum to debate these critical questions. We believe this campus at the heart of Washington, D.C. should serve as a vehicle to debate new ideas, to analyze the challenges we face, and to propose solutions. It's in that spirit that the family of Robert and Donna Lloyd George established the Lloyd George Lecture Series in honor of British Prime Minister David Lloyd George on the future of the global order, to debate in long form the key challenges and opportunities that will reshape our future. And it is in that spirit that we are so pleased to welcome here today Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton back to Georgetown University's campus to discuss American leadership in foreign affairs. And we're also pleased to welcome Ambassador Bill Burns to lead the conversation. She's been here all day with many key members of our foreign policy team to discuss the challenges we face ahead and to propose solutions to move forward in the face of these critical global risks. So let's get started, and we want to start with a student by bringing to the podium Abby Nichols, a member of the School of Foreign Service, class of 2020, to introduce our speakers today. Thank you, and let's have Abby Nichols to the stage.
Thank you, Dean Hellman. Welcome, everyone, to the keynote conversation of today's Future of Diplomacy Symposium, featuring Secretary Hillary Clinton and Ambassador Bill Burns. My name is Abby Nichols, and I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. I first want to thank the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy and the Walsh School of Foreign Service for hosting this symposium. I am deeply grateful for this opportunity to learn about diplomacy and foreign affairs from individuals as accomplished as today's panelists. I know I've thoroughly enjoyed attending all of today's events, and I hope you all have as well. I became involved in geopolitics almost 2 years ago through their student-run podcast, Fly on the Wall. First by running its social media and marketing campaign, and now as its managing director. It has meant so much to me to be able to interview the wonderful guests that geopolitics brings to campus and hear their stories firsthand. I've been so appreciative of geopolitics for hosting events like this, where hundreds of Georgetown students can come to listen to politicos and public servants, learning more about the complex worlds around them from experts. Let me speak briefly about our guests. Secretary Hillary Clinton has spent 4 decades in public service as an advocate, attorney, First Lady, United States Senator, Secretary of State, and presidential candidate. Over the course of a distinguished career, she championed healthcare, human rights, and democracy, and she broke new ground as a global leader for women's rights. As the 67th Secretary of State, she played a central role in strengthening America's leadership and position on the world stage. Secretary Clinton led the effort to impose sanctions on Iran, laying the foundation for a historic agreement to curb its nuclear program, and negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas that prevented a new war in the Middle East. Across the world, she defended universal values and pushed the frontiers of human rights. And here on campus, she helped inspire and launch the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and now serves as the honorary chair of the Institute. We're grateful and excited to welcome Secretary Clinton back to campus today. Moderating today's conversation is Ambassador Bill Burns, who served 33 years in the United States Foreign Service, most notably as the U.S. Ambassador to Russia and Deputy Secretary of State. Ambassador Burns holds the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest rank in the Foreign Service, and now serves as the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As we hear from these 2 accomplished diplomats, we hope you'll join the conversation online using the hashtag #FutureOfDiplomacy. Now, please join me in welcoming Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Burns.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Madam Secretary, it really is great to see you. I'd almost forgotten how nice it is to follow you on stage in the wake of all that applause and genuine affection for you. It really is richly deserved. And I want to thank Joel and Abby for those very thoughtful introductions. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience for whom I have huge respect. And most of all, it's great for all of us to be with you, Madam Secretary. This gathering is a vivid reminder for all of us of what you and President Obama did to build respect for American diplomacy around the world. And it's a reminder also of the respect that you always demonstrated for foreign policy professionals, for career professionals, and for public service. I also remember vividly another Wednesday, almost exactly 10 years ago, when I introduced you on your first day as Secretary of State to an uncharacteristically raucous crowd at the C Street entrance of the State Department, and many in that crowd are here today. Maybe a little less youthful, but no less raucous and no less proud to have had the chance to serve you and American diplomacy. Today, I have to say that seems not just a decade ago, but a couple of lifetimes ago. The world and our own country are going through some profound transformations, and so is the profession of diplomacy. So we have lots of good questions already from the audience, and I want to leave plenty of time for you to address those. But I want to start with a few of my own, and maybe focus first on the ways in which you tried to rebalance our portfolio of policy priorities to fit a changing world. And then after that, talk a little bit about an equally important rebalancing challenge, which was how do you rebalance the tools in the national security toolkit, especially to renew diplomacy as our tool of first resort. So maybe start with the landscape. I mean, you certainly as secretary inherited a very complicated international landscape. I remember a long conversation with you on your first day in the transition office on the first floor of the State Department. And I have to admit, I was a little nervous. I think I was the first senior career official to sit down with you. And so I didn't want to screw up that first impression for the rest of my colleagues. And I remember also that in the grand tradition of the State Department, where anything worth doing is worth overdoing, we had already killed a lot of trees, probably forests, and produced dozens and dozens of fat briefing books with hundreds of papers on every imaginable issue, probably some that strained your imagination as well. So I figured that it was better to have an informal conversation. I remember jotting down a few notes on an index card for a discussion that I think ended up going for about 2 hours. But I remember being very impressed with how sharply focused you were in that first conversation about rebalancing priorities to reflect power relations not just among states with the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and all the threats that brought, the need to change the terms of our engagement in the Middle East, the need to focus more on two parts of the world that haven't historically gotten the attention they deserve in American foreign policy, in Africa and in our own hemisphere. And then a whole set of challenges, as you knew very well, that went beyond states, beyond the capacity of individual states to deal with them, whether it's climate change or the revolution in technology, something you spent your whole adult life fighting for, the political and economic empowerment of women, the increasingly intense competition in ideas between open political and economic systems and closed or authoritarian ones too. So just a long setup for asking, as you take a look back on that landscape, a decade ago, what was the picture you saw? And as you look back on it now, what are the biggest changes and what surprised you?
Well, that's a great landscape setting question. I just want to again thank Georgetown and particularly the School of Foreign Service and the Public Policy School and everyone who's been involved in this event, and all of the students, some of whom waited for many hours to get in, and unfortunately there were, I'm told, 150 left outside. And I think it goes to the importance of having conversations like this. As Dean Hellman said, Georgetown occupies a unique position, not only in Washington or in our country, but indeed in the world. And having conversations like this about the future that we face, whether it is in economics or in social and civil rights, or in this case of diplomacy, is a key part of Georgetown's mission. So I'm honored to be here. I want to just take us back 10 years. And for some of you, you were in elementary school then. But that's why I want to just spend a minute setting the stage. So when President-elect Obama asked me to be Secretary of State, which was a shock, to put it mildly, he basically said, look, we have a serious financial crisis that we have to cope with. We've got to dig our economy out of the ditch that it's in. And we have a serious lack of trust and real understanding around the world because the prior 8 years had been predominantly, when it came to international relations, focused on Iraq, Afghanistan, and the related issues of terrorism. And many in the world were feeling that the United States didn't care about their country or even their region. And he I remember jokingly said, I'm going to focus on the economy, you go focus on the world, which I think I actually got the better of the deal to start with. But I remember when I started making calls, because I had met a number of leaders during the 90s when I was a senator from New York, And there was a very common refrain. We just don't know what the United States wants to do other than fight against terrorists and try to protect your security, which we appreciate as a critical priority, of course. But particularly in Asia, and as Bill said, in Latin America and in Africa, that was the refrain. But it wasn't just there, it was also in Europe. There had been some really contentious meetings between representatives of the Bush administration and European leaders. So there was a hopefulness that maybe we could begin to repair some of the damage and try to find some new ways of working together. But there was a reluctance. And I remember talking to the fabled Ambassador Burns, because indeed he is fabled, that first day, and others in the State Department who came to brief me as I was getting ready for my hearings. And he's absolutely right. There were huge notebooks filled with hundreds of pages of information about the entire world. And it struck me then that obviously we couldn't do everything, but we had to demonstrate a much greater willingness to engage. And that's when I started talking about how we needed to use smart power. Because traditionally, there had been a bit of a diametric bifurcation. You were either for hard power, which means things like military power, obviously with all the consequences that we had seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, or soft power, which is more development-oriented, more culturally outreaching. And it seemed like a false dichotomy to me, because I thought that we needed to be smart about using both hard and soft power and hopefully chart a new course for diplomacy going forward. So the first trip I took was to Asia, because that's where I got the loudest complaints. People who were watching China's rise, and they weren't at that time, 10 years ago, overly nervous about it, but they did want to make sure the United States was back in the arena and that we would have a closer cooperation to try to work with China in a both peaceful and we hoped effective way. So off I went to Japan, to South Korea, to Indonesia, where, as some of you remember, President Obama had spent a few years of his childhood, and then to China. And it was a listening tour in a lot of ways, because I was getting earfuls, as were all of the diplomats with me, about what had been left behind that we had not been paying attention to. And in every region of the world, those were the conversations we were having. And in addition to trying to, better calibrate our relations with individual states and with regions, we did think that there were global problems that had to be addressed. Obviously, climate change, which we began from the first day. We had special experts in the State Department working with agencies across the government to try to see what we could do on a multilateral basis. The continuing challenge of terrorism and international crime that wasn't just, located in, the Middle East or South Asia, but indeed was a global problem. Women's rights, gay rights, a lot of issues that reflected our values and reflected what we wanted to stand for as the United States during the Obama presidency. And the last thing I would say is this. We just had two excellent panels for those of you who were able to attend those. And there was a panel about values. And it is clear that oftentimes, as Milan Verveer, who moderated that panel, pointed out, some people roll their eyes, values, whatever, all we need to worry about is how we show strength, how we dominate, and how we try to divide up the world to control it to our benefit and in furtherance of our interests. Or on the other hand, values, what a bunch of hypocrites. We don't even follow our own values. So why are we going around talking about women's rights or human rights or any other value-laden message when we're not, perfect ourselves? I think that misses the point. I mean, if we're talking about the future of diplomacy, which I believe is inextricably linked to the future of the United States, you give up your commitment to furthering universal values. You give up a big part of your message and your leverage and your strength in making the case for freedom and democracy and the kind of sustained commitment to the sort of world we want, not only for ourselves, but for everyone. So it was a big challenge and a lot of work that had to be done almost immediately to send a different message and then to try to back it up, not just with a visit, but with a sustained relationship. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, Bill, but one of the problems we face and the future of diplomacy faces is the kind of pendulum swinging back and forth. In comes one administration, throws out a carefully negotiated agreement to limit the potential of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And Bill was in on the ground floor with that. When I was there, Jake Sullivan was beginning the negotiations to see whether it could be possible, and John Kerry did a masterful job finishing it up. And it's not just, okay, we're going to get rid of this agreement and put in something different, or we're going to take the agreement and we think there are some problems, let's see if maybe we can negotiate within its parameters to get it to be better, in our opinion. It's like, oh no, it's gone. Climate, gone. And at some point, if you're a friend and ally, right, of the United States, you sit there and you think, well, can we trust them? Can we believe them? Because it's not just administration to administration, it's the United States of America. It's our government. It's giving our word. It is following through. So I think that, we have to be smarter about how we sustain our involvements and our commitments going forward.
I think you're exactly right, Madam Secretary. Predictability and credibility are sometimes overused terms, but they matter enormously, especially when you're dealing with hugely consequential phenomena like the rise of China, as you mentioned before, with lots of friends, allies, partners across Asia watching how we react to that very carefully, sharing some of the same concerns as well. But could you talk a little bit, since that was such an important focus of your time as Secretary, the rebalance to Asia, talk a little bit more about that relationship with China and the web of friendships and alliances that you work so hard to build across Asia as a way not so much of containing China, but helping to shape its rise so it doesn't come at the expense of everybody else's prosperity and security.
Well, I think the consequential nature of our relationship with China is not just because we are two very powerful nations with our own interests that we have to try to negotiate with one another. But there is a historic precedent that when a rising power meets an established power, and in this case we would be the established power and China would be the rising power, negotiating that relationship usually ends up in one of two ways. The rising power dominates and essentially relegates the establishment power to a second tier, lower position of influence. Or there's conflict, where literally there is a conflict over how this relationship is going to be managed in the future. I believed, and we posited, on a number of the people who were involved in this effort, we wanted to make the case that it didn't have to be either or. I am not in favor of the United States giving up our position, our leadership, or our power. I think that's not only bad for us, I think it's bad for the balance of power, if you're a realpolitik believer, or the management of relationships and global problems. So what we were attempting to do, and I think we had made some progress in this effort, was to make it clear to the Chinese we were not looking for conflict, and we frankly were not looking to be deposed. We were looking for a way to, as some have said, help pave the path for China to become a, quote, responsible stakeholder, at the table where decisions were made, but with an understanding of the broader responsibilities that go with that level of economic, increasingly military, and political power. It was something we decided to embark on by making clear we wanted an ongoing dialogue between our government and the Chinese government on many, many levels. There had been an economic dialogue in the prior administration where diplomats, treasury officials, and others would meet with their counterparts, and that was critically important. But I wanted to expand that into having it be strategic and economic, because there were many issues that didn't just fall directly under the economic category. So we began to do that, the strategic and economic dialogue. And as Bill said, I really believe strongly in making the effort to build relationships with your counterparts. It's not going to change their mind if they're pursuing a strongly held position that is in their interests, that they are there to promote. But it can soften the edges a little bit. It can open some doors and create some greater understanding. So we invested a lot of time and effort in building those relationships with our Chinese counterparts, while at the same time taking very strong stands on our traditional areas of difference over Tibet, over Taiwan. But then early in my tenure, the Chinese added another red line, in their opinion, which was the South China Sea. And we knew, or I believe strongly, that you couldn't just overlook that and let them begin to assert that without, saying, wait a minute, you do not own the South China Sea. A vast percentage of the global maritime trade goes through there. The United States has treaty allies. We have long friendships. We are not going to stand by and say that you are now, by default, going to control the South China Sea. Big point of contention. We used to have, what amounts to, screaming matches in diplomacy, where, you stand very firmly and take your position and push back. And at one point I remember my Chinese counterpart was basically saying, we've had claims on these atolls and these reefs and these islands, going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and we can show you a map. And I said, well, we saved the Pacific. We saved, you all from, destruction in World War II, and I can show you a map. We should control the whole thing. I mean, that, we go back and forth. But it was a serious argument, and we were beginning to lay down some real markers, like the Philippines went to the International Court of Justice and got affirmed in their claim that the areas that the Chinese were deciding to essentially militarily colonize belong to the Philippines, but there has to be follow-through. I mean, you make these cases, and everybody knows. I mean, I know that they know that I know that they're going to press their position, just like vice versa. But you press because you're trying to reach, the best possible outcome among some really bad ones. And if you don't follow through, if you just you have diplomats working really hard to make these cases, and then if the next administration, whatever the next administration is, comes in and the focus totally turns elsewhere, and there's no real support from the White House or from the 7th floor of the State Department, then the other side kind of goes, oh, well, dodge that one, and they go back to their aggressive, intrusive behavior. So right now, I'd say we are losing the influence contest to China. China has an incredibly vigorous outreach program. You've heard about their efforts to build infrastructure across from East Asia into South Asia, into Central Asia, literally into Southern Europe. their Belt and Road project, which is kind of the new version of the Silk Road project. They are engaged in enormous amounts of cultural diplomacy, of funding projects in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere. And we are not competing. We're not competing not only on a governmental level, we're not competing through the private sector to the extent that we need to be. So China is doing what they have every right to do, which is to bring their influence, bring their soft power, their smart power to bear to obtain more friends, to have more support in the international community so that they are always ready to pursue their own advantage. And I think we're basically engaged in this, trade dispute, which is, happening on some higher level of back and forth between leaders. But below that, the Chinese are incredibly focused on amassing as much influence as they can everywhere in the world, and the military sites that they are building match their military buildup. So, we are not doing everything we should to have this kind of balance that I think we need, and we talked about pivoting to Asia, rebalancing, but all of it means you got to stay engaged for the long run, not just sporadically.
Well, I think all of it means, too, just as you described in Asia, that diplomacy is more important than ever. I mean, the United States is no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. We can't get everything we want on our own or by force alone. But what sets us apart, as you just described, from lonelier major powers like China and Russia are our alliances, our capacity to invest in coalitions, the kind of agency we have in setting agendas on lots of these different issues. I mean, that applies not just in Asia, but in Europe as well, which is another place where I think doubts have been raised on the part of the White House about our long-term commitment to those alliances. I mean, I remember when we talked about the pivot to Asia, there was a certain amount of pivot envy in Europe, countries who were worried a little bit about where their future lay. And you worked really, really hard to allay that. But how do you see Europe today? I mean, it's got huge internal challenges, Brexit most visibly, but almost any place you look on the geopolitical compass, uncertainty about the transatlantic relationship to the west, to the south across the Mediterranean, migration flows, insecurity, and then to the east, the pugnacity of Vladimir Putin. So, how do you see the transatlantic relationship right now? We're almost to the 70th anniversary of NATO, and there's a big question mark over all of that, I think.
Well, I remember when I was going into the State Department, and I would ask people, what are America's strongest assets? After 8 years of economic problems and wars and all sorts of challenges, what are our biggest assets in the world? And no matter what other answer anybody gave me, in that answer would be, America's alliances are the envy of everyone. Nobody else has that kind of network of support that can be deployed on behalf of specific goals, but which provides a kind of ballast, for everything else going on in the world. And the more you thought about it, certainly I concluded, wow, we take it for granted. We don't talk that we have this incredible alliance in the North Atlantic that goes back to the end of the Second World War, but has steadily reached out and included people who wanted to be members. There was nothing coercive about it. Russia was desperate to stop nation states from being members, but part of what we want to promote is states being able to make those choices, to be part of a democratic alliance. Or in Asia, our relationships in Japan and South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, lots of places that were hard fought for and which made a big difference in how we were viewed and how we conducted ourselves. So when you look at Europe right now, there is a real danger. It's not just a regrettable potential. It's a danger that an organization like NATO, or the EU, of which we are not a member, but which we promoted because we believed that a Europe whole, free, at peace was not only good for Europeans, but good for us because we had fought 2 wars in the preceding century. So when you look at what is happening in Europe, it should be of great concern to any American. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. And the fact that our current administration is almost egging on the breakup of NATO, and certainly insulting a lot of our longest allies. You know, just because we have an ally doesn't mean that we agree with everything or that we accept whatever they do uncritically. Of course not. But to be in a hostile relationship with people who share a lot of our values, who we have gone through a lot with, strikes me as really counterproductive and, as I said, potentially dangerous. And what bothers me, and I think what concerns a lot of the Europeans, is democracy is going through some growing pains. Maybe that's inevitable. I mean, there is always reason to take a hard look at how you govern yourself, conduct yourselves, relate to one another. You know, here in the United States, lots of really important, legitimate questions about, you know, how the economy works and who it favors and who it doesn't favor, and, you know, how we can maintain our diversity and inclusivity in the face of, you know, it being challenged by so many who are either feeling not included or against inclusion, you know, all of these issues that are being played out every single day in our political system. So we're going through growing pains, and so are the Europeans. And when that happens, we need our friends. We need people that we have worked with and counted on. And I think the division that is being unfortunately driven between the United States and Europe is going to haunt us. And if I could do anything to convince, you know, the current administration, it would be to, you know, come on, you know, we need the Europeans. It's not just we're doing something nice for them. We need them. And if you know anything about history, you know that we'll end up getting drawn in one way or another if we don't continue to work together to have a vigorous dialogue about where we stand on various issues. I guess the final point is, you know, when you take things for granted, as we have, I think, now for a number of years, about our stability, our predictability, our prosperity, even though it's uneven and unequal, you know, you begin to see people getting a little bored. I think Brexit is as much a desire to just throw the dice in the air, play the game differently, be disruptors for the sake of being disruptors, and it will very likely turn out to be one of the, you know, worst self-inflicted harms that any country has done to itself if the current situation continues and there is no deal about what it means to leave the European Union. And those forces, whether they are ideological forces, whether they are forces that really almost come from a position of, I just want to change, I don't care what it is, let's just do it, they are egged on, particularly in Europe, by Russia. And, you know, Russia has a stake in disrupting and dismantling the EU and NATO. We know that. We have seen them try, and now they seem to be even more determined than ever to wreak havoc internally in a lot of countries in Europe, and to try to drive wedges between Europe and the United States. So you have to both follow the money and follow the interest. And in whose interest is it that we would be disabling the North Atlantic Alliance? I think it would be in the interest of Russia more than any other player.
No, I mean, I think the problem is, you know, it's Putin is pretty transparent and unsentimental about being a disruptor. It's when we become a feeder of that disruption that it creates huge challenges as well, because just as you suggested, that's when allies start to hedge, adversaries take advantage, and all those institutions that we worked so hard over 70 years to help shape in our own enlightened self-interest, not as a favor at anybody else, start to teeter a little bit too. I wanted to ask you a question about diplomacy because one of the things you and President Obama did so effectively right from the very beginning of the first term was to, attach a clear priority to that. I think it was a day or two after the inauguration, President Obama came to the State Department, talked about the importance of diplomacy and renewing American leadership. I saw lots of different relationships between Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense. You had particularly effective ones with Bob Gates and Leon Panetta. What lessons did you draw from that experience of trying to, ensure that diplomacy really is the tool of first resort, not kind of an under-resourced afterthought?
It's really an important point because, look, the State Department budget is, totally overwhelmed by the defense budget, which, is usually like 12 to, 14 times more. And you throw in all the intelligence agencies. I mean, the State Department doesn't have on its own the kind of financial resources to go head-to-head with the Defense Department. So I was lucky because before I ever got there, Bob Gates made it very well known that if you didn't have strong diplomacy, you would have more conflict. And he used to talk about how, there were fewer Foreign Service professionals at the State Department than there were members of the 4 service band and orchestra groups. And so he was, from the beginning, an ally for smart power, for trying to have a more assertive, relationship-based diplomacy. And that made the world easier for me because we did, in that first term, increase the budget for a lot of State Department functions, do a big outreach to get more people interested in applying for the Foreign Service, try to fill up the pipeline, try to do what we talked about in one of the panels this morning, not only train but retain and promote people so that we could demonstrate that we were vigorously using every tool that we had to promote diplomacy and to give our diplomats real support and a certain level of flexibility and discretion. That we didn't want to have a top-down kind of bureaucratic process where you were told you can't do something because somebody sitting in Washington thinks you can't do it. Instead, let's have that dialogue, and wherever possible, let's make sure that we listen to the people who are on the ground, who are the experts. And then Leon Panetta was another great ally because, having been at the CIA. He went over to DOD, and we were able to continue the close working relationship. And what did that mean in practice? Well, it meant that we spent a lot of time talking with each other about how to handle problems. And most likely it was in the Situation Room of the White House, but it might be over dinner. It might be I went to see them, or they came to see me for lunch. However we could find the time to kind of go through what the problems were and to figure out the best role for diplomacy. And let's not forget development, because when I talk about diplomacy, I also mean development, because very often the best diplomacy is to help to tackle problems that need some kind of financial resourcing. And just a quick aside on that, if we spent by the federal government's budget, a relatively minor amount of money in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, dealing with some of their problems and working against corruption, and in effect trying to do some of what we did in Colombia to help end, the conflict and deal with the incredible toll that both the drug traffickers and their militias were taking, along with, government-sponsored militias, trying to figure out where we could strategically help those countries do a better job dealing with their problems on the ground, then all this talk about poor, desperate people fleeing gang violence and fleeing drug traffickers and fleeing economic distress, we'd be having a different conversation. So when we would have these discussions, that's what we were looking for. I mean, I don't think that changed when General Mattis was there, because he had the same approach. He had seen it. I remember visiting him when he was the Marine commander in Iraq, who had been responsible for the first Battle of Fallujah. And I went in there with John McCain and a couple of other senators shortly after that battle had been completed. And what Mattis wanted was development aid and diplomats, and he wanted experts who could try to figure out how to rebuild a society that had been ripped apart by conflict. So I think it's important to try to get a full government response, to try to bring everybody together. It's difficult. I don't want to oversell it. It's hard. People come from their own experiences and expertise. But as much as you can try to do that, so that you maximize the benefits of each agency or department, and you can figure out strategically what's the first thing you do, and then if that doesn't work, how do you follow up? And both Gates and Panetta were great partners in talking all of that through with me.
I think it's a really good example of what you can accomplish when you're working toward that same end. Madam Secretary, we have a lot of terrific questions from the students who are here, so I wanted to turn to some of them. And the first one is from Ava Stiles, who's a freshman at Georgetown, and she asks, what is your advice for young women who are interested in politics?
Well, if you didn't see it, or if you couldn't bear to see it last night, you might have missed the sea of white of all of the women, many of them young women, who ran for and were elected to the United States Congress. And I think if you are interested in politics, you do not have to be a candidate to be interested in politics. There's a lot of roles in campaigns, in offices of public officials, but get out there and get involved. Get involved in a campaign, get involved in working for somebody. It's one of the advantages of being in Georgetown, because you can do that. But then ultimately, if you decide, or if you have the feeling inside that you want to get yourself into politics, you just have to study it and think about it and prepare for it, and then get in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt famously said. I don't think he was thinking about young women in politics, but I'm going to, expand him. And I don't think if he were around today he would mind, but we're going to expand who goes into the arena. And you just have to get out there. And this is a subject for a longer conversation, but in my book, What Happened, I have a whole chapter about women in politics, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are problems. There's still a double standard. There are all of these expectations that sometimes get imposed on you. But if you feel it and you want to try it, then don't give up. Just get out there and give it your all, but be prepared to do it.
And Elliot Mack, who's in School of Foreign Service here, class of 22, asks, what important steps will the next president have to take to restore the U.S.'s image on the international scene?
Well, I hope that the next president, whoever he or she might be, will be able to have a team that focuses a lot of attention on sort of repairing relations, undoing damage, setting a new course for the country. And it will be difficult because there are some things that are reversible, with a stroke of the pen, going back into agreements we've gotten out of, for example. But rebuilding that trust that credibility, that predictability, that is going to take time and sustained attention. It can't be, let's do it this week and then something else next week. It has to be sustained. But I'm hoping that that will be the attitude of the next administration.
Thanks. And Daisy Dunlap, who's also a class of 22 here at Georgetown. As a former Secretary of State, how would you respond to Senator Dick Durbin's statement earlier this week expressing concern about growing international trend toward authoritarianism? And how do you feel, about the situation in Venezuela as sort of one example of that?
Well, I'm really concerned about growing authoritarianism. And as I said earlier, I think democracy is going through growing pains. I think a lot of people are questioning some fundamental tenets of democracy. I think we have an administration that has demonstrated an affinity toward dictators because they can get things done, which shouldn't be a position that an American president or administration takes. So I do think that the rise in authoritarianism in a lot of places and the rise of political parties within democracies that are much more authoritarian, much more willing to kind of dismiss process and institutional integrity should be troubling. And if you look at Venezuela, Venezuela has been a slow motion crisis that is now crescendoing. And it is going to reach some resolution. I hope it can be a peaceful resolution. I hope that Maduro and his close associates will, seek exile. I hope that the hard work of rebuilding a prosperous economy with more economic rewards for a much larger group of citizens of Venezuela, rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure that will be necessary to rebuild the economy, reinstating more of a democratic process despite the frustrations we all have with democracy, but that kind of is baked into the pie. That is almost a check and balance for democracy to avoid authoritarianism. So I would hope that what we're seeing now will lead to a change in power, and equally important, a change in attitude and expectation and aspiration. And I hope that there will not be the need for any kind of military intervention by anybody, whoever they might be supporting. And it will take some delicate diplomacy to work that through. I know there was a meeting in Canada just in the last day or two with a lot of countries recognizing the opposition leader and trying to find a way forward for Maduro to peacefully leave. But they're going to be leaving a mess, and Venezuela and whoever the new leadership is will require a lot of support, and it needs to be support that is sensitive to the suffering of the Venezuelan people over the last many years, and the exiling, the self-exiling of so many people who could no longer make a living, could no longer get the medicine they needed, could no longer afford a loaf of bread, who've gone to Colombia or Brazil or other places. So I think we should all hope for a peaceful transition of power, and it looks more possible now than it has in any time in the past years.
I have a question here about arms control. It comes from another member of the class of 22 at the School of Foreign Service, from James Bond. And he's written underneath, actually my name. I believe you. And so his question is, what are the probable implications of President Trump pulling out of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and also the New START Agreement, which you did as much as anyone to accomplish, which expires in 2021 on strategic nuclear weapons. So what's your sense of that?
Well, I think it's a gift to Putin. I think for the United States to leave the INF Treaty without really holding Putin accountable for his cheating on the treaty, because I think there is agreement. It started in the Obama administration that the Russians were not only developing intermediate range capacity, but deploying it. And so when that happens, under a treaty that goes back to Reagan, it seems to me that you want to do some public diplomacy. You know, we clearly have pictures, and we clearly know a lot about their cheating. And we should have done a better job in making it abundantly clear, not only to the American people, but the Russian people and Europeans and others who are on the front lines, that the Russians were evading their responsibilities in the INF. And we should have also demanded immediate talks to lay on the table what we knew and to begin a process of trying to push them back. Instead, you know, we pull out. So Putin says, oh, the Russians, I mean, they're going to go forward and develop even more of these now. It imposes an economic burden on them. We know that. But at the same time, it increases the unpredictability and I believe the danger that can come from, you know, throwing around more missiles and weapons of all kinds, but particularly nuclear ones, within the European theater. So I look at what's called the New START Treaty, which, as Bill said, we negotiated that in that first term, you know, to lower the numbers of nuclear weapons that both the United States and Russia had. In that treaty, we have access to their sites. It includes verifiability. It includes our being able to visit and go places within Russia to understand what they have. Now, it's reciprocal, but you know, we have a much more open society, so a lot of what we're doing, or where our missiles are stored, where our nuclear warheads are developed, is more publicly known. So it was a big advantage for the United States, and that came from prior arms control agreements, that we would have this reciprocal investigation authority. Again, you know, if this administration decides it doesn't like arms control treaties and decides it's going to pull out of New START or just not reauthorize it, we will be in the dark. And yes, we have all kinds of intelligence, surveillance capabilities. But why do that when we can have an agreed upon framework? And if they cheat, hold them accountable. Make it a public issue. You know, really point the finger at them. See if you can get them back into the terms of an agreement, rather than having them go on the outside and then basically, you know, play with the lives of people, the potential of greater instability. So I think it was a mistake. I think we could have done other smarter ways of holding them accountable for their cheating, and we could have educated ourselves and the rest of the world about the Russians. And the final point I would make is there's no doubt that we should have multilateral arms control agreements that include China and others. That is absolutely the case. It is a very long process to do that. We should be starting it. It's not either or. It's not either we have everybody in an agreement or we have no agreement. It should be, okay, we have agreements, we're going to keep enforcing those agreements, we're going to build on those agreements, and at the same time, we're going to be expanding multilateral negotiations. And we're going to keep beating up on the Chinese and others so that, you know, they see that there is some cost, public cost, of them not being in an agreement where there can be reciprocity and where we try to limit nuclear weapons. The last thing the world needs right now is a nuclear arms race. We have so much unpredictability. The idea that we would do this, and I've heard some of the commentators who agree with, you know, the administration, and they say things like, well, we'll bankrupt them again. Well, okay, fine, and bankrupt ourselves in the process because we're already driving up the deficit and the debt to unsustainable levels. So everything has consequences, both intended and unintended, and I think that pulling out of this INF agreement will have a lot of intended and unintended consequences.
But everything you just described is what diplomacy is all about, and it's the difference between a serious commitment to diplomacy in our own self-interest and a kind of muscular unilateralism, which creates all sorts of risks, as you described.
Well, Bill, I just want to mention, Bill has been in the Foreign Service, as you heard, for 33 years and has held all of these, major positions, and he has a book coming out in March called Back Channel, which is a memoir about American diplomacy. And so maybe you could just say something from your experience about the dangers of quick reactions or unilateral actions, as you say, muscular unilateral actions, as though that solves a problem.
Well, I just think that the landscape in which the United States is operating on right now is precisely the kind of landscape in which a serious commitment to diplomacy matters more than ever. As I said before, we're not the only big kid on the block anymore, but we still, I honestly believe, have a much better hand to play than any of our rivals if we play it wisely, and that's really the question. And there's a window before us which extends, I'm an optimist, it extends out, as far as I can see, in which we have an opportunity to reshape an international landscape and adapt our alliances and institutions, again in our own self-interest, before they get shaped for us by the rise of other powers and other events. And so, while we still have a strong hand, and we ought to be, confident and affirmative about that, there needs to be a sense of urgency as well. And so, this book, which you're very kind to mention, is part memoir because, it's always hard to bring, diplomacy to life for a wider readership. We do tend to operate a lot of times in the back channel, kind of out of sight and out of mind. So, it's partly aimed at illuminating that a little bit, over the course of my own 3.5 decades and, serving 5 presidents, 10 secretaries of state, but also dealing with a kaleidoscope of complicated and oftentimes creepy foreign leaders from Putin to Gaddafi. So that's one purpose of it, but the other part is an argument. The argument is about the renewal of diplomacy for all the reasons that you already very eloquently described.
Well, I think that, we are making the case for diplomacy, obviously, today, but I really think, as Bill just said, it is a case for America. Other countries have diplomats. Let's obviously recognize that. But no other country has the range of issues that can be addressed by diplomacy or the diversity of diplomats who can contribute a life experience perspective as well as a professional one. And that is one of our biggest assets. And I worry a lot about sort of surrendering our assets. I am hopeful. You're an optimist. I'm hopeful. But I want to see more Americans understand what's at stake for them when it comes to diplomacy, because it still is a bit of a mystery. And as Bill rightly said, it doesn't get the coverage. You don't get the kind of press attention to diplomats as you do with military leaders, obviously political leaders. But very often it's the diplomat who is sent off. And I'll just give you a quick story about the Iran nuclear deal. So when I became Secretary of State, the Obama administration had no role in what had happened the prior 8 years. We learned that Iran was enriching uranium, had built facilities, one secret facility, that it looked like it was on the path to a nuclear weapon. We inherited that. Now, as a senator, I had voted to sanction Iran every time it came up. Because I saw their behavior in the world as threatening, dangerous. But the rest of the world wasn't sanctioning Iran. We were. Every time anybody said, let's vote on a sanction, we all marched up and voted on a sanction. So there was no cost for Iran in this nuclear program that it was apparently pursuing. So we asked ourselves, don't you think there's got to be a better way of dealing with this? Because the last thing we wanted was a nuclear-armed Iran, which would catalyze the fastest arms race in the history of the world, because every one of Iran's Arab, Muslim neighbors or adversaries would have to have their own nuclear arms program. We saw a nightmare scenario. And what we had to do was persuade the Security Council of the United Nations to vote with us so that there would be global sanctions which would send a message to Iran, we're not fooling around and we're going to hold you accountable. So that's what we spent, as you recall, Bill, like a year and a half doing. And one of the things that helped us, I remember I was in a meeting in New York during the UN session with Medvedev, who was then the president, and his foreign secretary, Lavrov, and their national security advisor, and President Obama, me, and our national security advisor at the time, Jim Jones. And we told them we knew about a secret facility that they had stocked with centrifuges and that was running 24/7. The Russians were stunned because they believed that they had a handle on what was going on in Iran. But because we made it clear to them that this was a serious program with consequences that would affect the entire region and beyond, all of a sudden they were open to talking, and we began to negotiate with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council as well as others. And I spent a lot of my time and it wasn't in the headlines, I wasn't doing interviews about it. The whole team, Bill and others who were working to support it, it was just the slow, steady grind of diplomatic efforts until finally, in June of 2010, I think, we got the vote in the Security Council. And then Iran knew that they would pay a price. And it's then that we began to test whether they would enter into negotiations. And so all of this was painstaking. So when I hear somebody say, it didn't amount to anything, or what, they don't know the history, or they don't care to know the history. They don't understand the painstaking diplomacy that went into the agreement that was finally negotiated. And they don't want to hear what our intelligence community says, because we're still surveilling. We haven't, rolled up our interest in that and put it away, that they haven't violated it yet. So that's the kind of story that I wish more people would pay attention to understand what it took.
I think that's exactly right. And you underscore another really important point about diplomacy is that it's not just about talking to people. It's about building leverage and focusing people's minds. And the reason the Iranians were ready to talk more seriously is because, the value of their currency had dropped by 50% as a result of all the sanctions you built, and their volume of their oil exports had dropped by 50% too. But we were also willing to deal with them directly. So I know we're starting to run out of time, but I wanted to end maybe with one final question, especially recognizing all the terrific Georgetown students that are here right now, and Georgetown's extraordinary record of turning out, generations of extraordinary career foreign policy professionals. This is a rough time, I think, to make the case to young people that public service has value, it's rewarding, it's fulfilling, and particularly career diplomatic service or career civil service. What's your message to young people today at a moment when there are lots of obvious doubts out there about whether this is really worth it? I mean, what do you say to them?
Well, I think we're at the right place to have that conversation, because even earlier today, I met so many Georgetown students who understand the importance of being involved in foreign policy and diplomacy and development, who have a real urge to pursue that as a career. Maybe enter the foreign service or the civil service or some other role that gives them the chance to, be a player in helping to shape the future of the world, not to put too fine a point on it. I think we need you more than ever. there's a lot of hard work that has to be done, but there's also a lot of room for imagination. What are we going to do with technology to make sure it enhances cooperation and problem solving, not disruption and misinformation? That's a huge issue right now. How are we going to deal seriously with climate change from the ground up? We're not in the agreement. We're the only country in the world not in the agreement, but states and businesses and cities and individuals and organizations are working really hard to kind of move the United States forward. And how do we get people who understand the importance of that and are speaking that to everyone who will listen as diplomats on behalf of our country? How do we deal with the human tragedy of migration, refugees, asylum seekers, people who wash up on shores or cross dangerous borders? Because if you were in their position and you were trying to save your life or save your child or save your family, you'd be there too. How do we regain the empathy and the humanity that needs to be present? How do we keep moving to finish the unfinished business of women's rights in the world? We've made progress, but there's pushback in lots of places, and we still have much work to be done. How do we continue to stand up for the rights of the LGBT community? I went to Geneva and made a speech about how gay rights are human rights, and yet there are many countries that are determined to deny full citizenship to their gay citizens. I mean, you go down the list of all of these global problems that are going to need the combined efforts of every tool in our toolkit of American power, and that certainly includes, first and foremost, diplomacy, as well as other non-state activities that can be done through NGOs, through great universities, and so much else. So I think it's one of the most exciting times to be looking at a career in public service and in particular in diplomacy. So I would hope that what we've done today to try to talk about some of the experiences, some of the problems, will lead to an even longer conversation during this 100th anniversary of the School of Foreign Service, so that even more students who themselves may not be interested in becoming a diplomat, but will understand more the importance of supporting diplomacy, who will understand that, this is one of our biggest advantages, and we have to recognize it and fund it and support the people who are doing it. So I'm pretty bullish about young people and diplomacy, because I've been fortunate enough to know a lot of young people who are interested in it, and I only hope that more and more people coming out of Georgetown will find their way to do that work as well, because we need you. That's the simple final answer. We need you. We need the energy, the imagination, and the skills of the next generation to deal with a lot of these problems.
Well, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for reminding us why all of us were so lucky to have you as Secretary of State, why we're so lucky that you're still in public life, and why all of us were so proud to work with you at the State Department. Thank you.
Thank you all.